Welcome to the How of Business with your host, Henry Lopez, the podcast that helps you start, run, and grow your small business. And now, here is your host.
Welcome to this episode of the How of Business. This is Henry Lopez, and my co-host David Begin is back for another episode.
Hello, Henry. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thought I had lost you there for a moment.
I know. Well, I'm fighting a cold. Sorry.
David is battling, not feeling well, but he's going to fight on through here and give us his opinions because he's got a lot to share on this important topic, which is complex decision making. Back on episode 526, David and I chatted about everyday decision making, just the topic in general. But, the decisions that we make quickly, somebody comes up to us, says, hey, what about this or that, or those kind of day-to-day operational decisions, they're slightly different when we're talking about complex decisions that we don't necessarily make right in the instance, or we probably should not. And so what is that process? How do we go about it? What is a recommended approach that we've learned from others and based on my research? How do we make those more complicated decisions? And that's what we're going to dive deeper into this episode. If you didn't listen to episode 526, it doesn't matter for this episode, but you may want to go back and listen to that episode as well. So how do we make those critical or complex decisions that can significantly impact the success of your business and maybe even your life? To get more information about the How of Business, including the show notes page for this episode, and I'm going to lay out on that show notes page these 4 steps to decision making. So you may want to visit the show notes page at thehowofbusiness.com. You'll find that there. You'll also find more information about my one-on-one and group coaching programs. So please visit thehowofbusiness.com. I also encourage you to please subscribe wherever you might be listening to this episode so you don't miss any new episodes. I also want to thank Dylan. Dylan, who owns a landscape business, recently gave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Greatly appreciate that. If you're enjoying this podcast and hopefully getting value from it, I ask that you please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you might be listening. So thanks again,
Dylan.
Dylan.
Dylan, I need you to come to my house.
Exactly. He's got a landscape issue.
Really
but thanks for that 5-star review. Greatly appreciated. So David Begin goes without introduction. For those of you who've been listening to the podcast for some time, he was my original, the OG co-host, and he comes back on periodically when we're graced by his presence. But just give us briefly what you're doing these days besides recuperating.
Yeah, recuperating, still doing car wash consulting. I'm thinking about transitioning that business to someone else and doing it on a part-time basis. And I'm thinking about kind of exploring other things. So I'm excited about that. It's a new opportunity for me to maybe do some things that aren't necessarily centered around making money, which I think will be interesting to see if I could actually do that.
Very interesting. You and I talked about it in another episode about identity and how ingrained that becomes in who we are. You are the successful car wash operator, the successful businessman. And so stepping away from that can be a challenge.
Yes. Yeah, it will be, but I'm looking forward to spending more time with my lovely bride and going to do other things and studying things that I'm interested in that, don't yield business opportunities.
Yep. And coming on the show and chatting about today, decision making, you led a very successful, a very profitable and multi-unit operation in the car wash industry. And you had to make a lot of big decisions in that arena, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you do. You make probably less bigger decisions and a lot of smaller decisions.
Agreed.
And so I believe if you practice the smaller decisions and you're able to execute on those relatively effectively, that'll kind of lay the groundwork of the foundation for you making big decisions. But if you get stuck with small decisions, you're certainly never going to get to make the big ones.
Right. And your energy is going to be drained. You're going to be exhausted. So we covered that in episode 526, those small decisions leading to decision fatigue and paralysis. And so by all means, what we propose and what we've tried to do in our businesses is to delegate those day-to-day operational decisions, to empower your team once you have a team to make those decisions. You give them certain guidelines, you give them certain rules to abide by, you give them parameters as to when it needs to be escalated to you. But ideally, you delegate those things to your team. But the higher level decisions, those complex decisions, those decisions about the direction of the business, and I'll kind of cover some of those. It overlaps here. This topic overlaps with what I've done in a couple of episodes here recently, is what is your responsibility as the CEO of your small business? What is it that you remain responsible for as long as you're somewhat actively involved in that business? It might be that you grow a business to a point where you hire a CEO, but for most of us as small business operators, we remain in that role of CEO. And so there are complex decisions that fall to us. But the point that we made in that earlier episode in 526 is that if you are making all of the decisions, then it's going to lead to fatigue. It's going to lead to wearing you down, burning you out, and getting to a point where you become paralyzed. Now, let's talk about those complex decisions. I kind of have a list here, David, and then I thought you can give me some thoughts as well. But things related to, here are the things that I think as the owner, as the CEO, we are responsible for the decision-making related to vision and mission. So where is the business going? Where are we headed? What's the vision and the mission of the business? The high-level goals and objectives of the business. For example, if you're an established business, what is your annual plan? What are the objectives for the year? What are our revenue targets? What are our profit targets? What are the other KPIs by which we're going to measure the business at the highest level? My dashboard as the CEO, deciding those things, that falls on me. Now, I might have a team that helps me with that. My leadership team might help me with that. Of course, partners will help with that. But that falls to me as the CEO. So that type of planning, the culture, the nurturing and monitoring of the culture, I think is a responsibility. Now, you may not have any single big decisions on there, you might think, but where I find that it comes into play is making a decision about a person in the team. And it could be a leadership position, which reports to you directly, that isn't a right fit culturally. And you might have them on board for all kinds of different reasons, right? They might even be related to you, but they're destroying the culture. That's an example, David, of a decision that falls on us as the CEO that impacts the culture, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Leadership. So again, that team that you lead and making decisions about that, who's on that team, who stays on that team, how do you lead that team? There are decisions around that you have to make. Key projects, right? So you're implementing a new system or researching a new project or developing a new product or service line. You might well have somebody on your team that is going to execute on it, but you're probably going to have to at least be involved in making a decision to even pursue a new service line or expand a geography or go into a new market or acquire another business. Those are the types of big decisions I'm talking about there. Customer service at a high level, especially if applies more, I think, in B2B, if there's a key customer that has an issue or is requesting something and you have to make a decision, that often might fall to you. Production issues and constraints. So the way that you produce the widgets that you make, those big decisions, which might lead to, let's say, well, to solve it, we need to upgrade equipment. You were making that decision often as it relates to the execution of the car wash in a tunnel, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You're always making those type of decisions,
And
especially with
those were
equipment.
big capital decisions that you had to make, right?
Right. Right.
Financials. So the financials of the business and what do they tell us, and making sure we interpret that and make decisions based on what the financials tell us. And then at a high level, branding and marketing. Who are we as a business? If we're going to evolve the branding, if we're going to now project ourselves differently in the marketplace, those are big decisions that usually fall on us. So any category that came to mind that I missed, David?
Yeah. I think especially in this environment, people that do go through mergers and acquisitions, people that want to acquire you, people that want to partner with you, where you establish partnerships, or even selling your business, are huge decisions. And they're kind of the ultimate business decisions that you have to go through, but especially this environment. Sometimes it doesn't happen at the individual level as much as it does at the higher level. It depends on what industry you're in, but those are huge choices that people have to make.
Huge is probably I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think the two most difficult decisions a business owner has to make is, and hopefully you don't have to make this one, do I need to shut down the business because it's just the business model is just not viable? Maybe it was and it's no longer. In other words, we can't continue losing money. So that's a hard one. We've had to do that.
Right.
And then perhaps equally hard is, I've got a great successful business. Do I sell it? Do I take a premium now, but am I missing out? You're absolutely right. Those decisions fall to us as the owner, us and our partners, if you have partners that are involved in those decisions.
Right.
So this decision making, these big decisions we're talking about now, they can be daunting for small business owners. We can feel very isolated. So following a more structured approach, I think, can help. You don't always necessarily have to follow all of the steps, as with anything, as we've talked about before, when you deconstruct something to learn it or to talk about it, it seems really complex. So it's not meant to be that complex, but we'll break it down so that we can talk about what might be some logical steps. We have 4 steps at a high level that we tend to follow. You and I have. We don't always follow it to the letter, but it gives you an idea, a framework to help you make these decisions. And so that's what we're going to walk through here, the 4 steps to help you make those complex decisions. So we'll start number 1, define the decision clearly. Now that might seem pretty obvious, but what is really the problem? Clearly articulating and identifying what is the decision that needs to be made and why is it so important? So understanding the problem in detail, I find, and you found as well, helps in focusing efforts and resources most effectively, right? So what is really the problem? And sometimes that takes some analysis, David, to get down to the root cause issue of this issue that we're having.
Yeah, that's correct. I think, it's either making a choice or trying to fix a problem. That's where I think it becomes important for you to clearly define what the problem is. And you and I have done that episode on root cause analysis, which I think is an important episode to go back and listen to. But a lot of times, if you haven't defined the problem and clarified it, you could be, making a decision on the wrong issue. Now, if you're selling your business, it's a pretty binary choice. Do I decide to do it or do I decide not to do it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just looked up the episode you're referring to because you're right. I think that's a great episode, episode 200. I re-released it not too long ago. So 200, just search for episode 200, fixing versus solving problems, I think comes into play there, understanding that, getting to the root cause. Let's say something that comes to mind might be that the obvious solution might be, upgrade the technology or implement a new tool. But really, when you analyze it, you realize, well, that's not really the problem at all. We're fine with the tool we have. We're just not using it correctly, or we haven't implemented it correctly. I worked with a client once that had a production management platform, and everybody hated it. But the reality was, and they were thinking about replacing it, right? They would have had to abandon lots of money and time they had spent to implement it to begin with. And then, of course, the expense of implementing a new system. In my analysis, they had just never really properly implemented it, meaning they didn't properly train the users.
Interesting.
And that was the core issue, really.
Yeah. That's a great example of identifying the root problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So a lot of these components of these steps, you may have heard of an approach called the decision matrix analysis. And I'll kind of highlight and summarize that in a moment, but I've embedded some of those components here. The decision matrix analysis, you might have also heard of it as a weighted decision matrix or a multi-criteria decision analysis, is a way to kind of apply a scorecard to making the decision. And there's some decisions where that might help. So I kind of highlight that. But here in this first step, what relates to that is defining what are the options, what are the possible options that you're considering. You and I have done this very effectively just by getting on a whiteboard and starting to list out, what are the potential options. No necessarily bad ideas, just get it all up there. and then narrow it down. You could argue that's part of that root cause analysis, but it's more than that. What are our possible options here that we can take? What are the possible paths that we can take here on addressing or making this decision?
Yeah, I think that's really important because that'll help kind of build the fence, the playground in which your mind needs to play in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, so step one is clearly defining what is really the decision that we're trying to make. Yeah. All right. Number two is gather all of the relevant information. And of course, these things overlap, right? That's what I meant by when we break it down, it sounds more cumbersome than it needs to be, but that's what we have to do to learn something new. Gather all the relevant information, do the research, collect all of the necessary data, all of the information that you need. In the previous episode, I had quoted Bill Kennedy, who had been on the show. He wrote the book 80/20 CEO. And I had shared with you his quote about when have you done enough research? When do you have enough data? And I said his quote was, if it's data driven, the decision or part of the decision, then if you are making decisions with less than 20% of the information, you're guessing. If you have more than 80%, you probably waited too long, end quote. And then you asked, well, how do you know when you have enough data? I was like, I don't know. So I reached back out to Bill to clarify that, and indulge me here. Let me read to you what he had to
Sure.
say about this, because I think it helps us with how do we apply that? How does he apply that? And he often is talking about here, Dave, as it relates to making a decision like buying another business, right? So big decisions, as you just highlighted, a merger and acquisition type decision. And so the context here is he's analyzing the data of that business, the financials, the numbers, all of that stuff to make a decision as to what to offer, what to value it at, whether to buy it or not. One of those go, no go decisions that you talk about. Yeah.
Sure.
So here's what he said to clarify. I typically use it to prove a point or concept that we need data and it's okay not to be perfect. Specifically, in the 80/20 process, we pull all the product and customer data from the company. This is the company that they're looking at acquiring. And then he continues, we focus on revenue, material margin, and cost. During the first data review, we find we're at about 20% of the way through the process. It typically takes a company 6 months to get the data well sorted. And at that point, after about 6 months or so, we are generally at 80% through the process. And so we encourage folks to not wait for the process to be fully completed. Generally, as soon as we get the data, we can tell where some of the obvious problems are, such as the product or the customer that's a negative margin. We encourage the team to make immediate action on the obvious problems, end quote. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more context to 80/20 as it is applied here, right?
Yeah.
And it speaks to my tendency, as I've mentioned many, many times, to overanalyze something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And I would agree. You're never going to have all the information. You're going to have to pick a point in which you're going to have to make a decision. And I've seen, and you and I have talked about this before, but I've seen people use information gathering as an excuse not to make a decision. And when they
Agreed.
start spinning out in decision paralysis, they'll use the excuse of needing more information to make that happen.
And it's because, David, as you and I were chatting a little bit before we started recording, we're afraid to make the decision because we might be wrong, quote unquote.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one thing that we talked about is we like to use the term right decision and wrong decision. And in most things in life, there's no right or wrong. You just have to make a decision. But we like to put that label on it so that we feel good if we make a decision with a good outcome, we say that's a right decision versus a wrong decision. But and that creates a lot of pressure if you have difficulty making decisions, to seek out quote unquote the right decision. So that's a label that we put on it. And if you're getting stuck and you're thinking in your brain about right decisions and wrong decisions, it might be best to kind of take those labels off of it and just say decision A or decision B.
Agreed. This is such a huge point. I think this is certainly at the core as to why we don't make decisions. And I'm talking about, let's just go back to decisions to even start a business but certainly these bigger decisions that then paralyze us. And then what results is no decision gets made, and the business either continues in the wrong direction, or you miss an opportunity, or you don't correct a problem that then continues to snowball and escalate, right? We just ignore it. We bury our head in the sand. And I get it. I've been there. So this is hard because there is no such thing as the right solution. Now, time might prove out, oh, look, that was the right solution, but that's hindsight, right? That's
Yeah.
the advantage of looking back at something. And then, of course, we can judge right or wrong. This
Yeah.
is why it's not easy. This is why, as I said in the previous episode, as a business owner, you have to embrace wanting to make these hard decisions. That doesn't mean you're not going to lose sleep over it, but you've got to make a decision based on the best information you can gather. And then, though, back to this point of the 80-20 rule that Bill Kennedy talks about, you got to be careful not to hide behind, I need more data.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, as you're saying that, Henry, it makes me think that if you're an owner or a CEO of a business, the inertia of making decisions falls on you. You've
Yes.
got to, for your company to be healthy and successful, you've got to have a culture of yourself or your management team of making decisions, relatively quickly. I mean, it doesn't have to be, always quick, but you've got to be effective at making decisions. If you're ineffective at making decisions, to me, it's almost like a cancer in an organization.
Absolutely.
And it's gonna kill it.
And it does start with you as the owner. And what I have seen is the reason for that is that people have come to learn that decision making at a high level is risky in this organization, because if
Yeah.
I get it wrong, quote unquote, there's a price to pay. So therefore, I won't make the big decisions, meaning my team, my leadership team. And so when you walk into an environment and you notice that everybody never makes a decision, they're afraid, we'll see what Henry thinks. And things are continuously in a quagmire. Nothing ever gets better. Nobody's making a decision. In my experience, that's why. Because Henry has made it painful for people to make decisions. Because I
Yeah.
second guess them, because I highlight how they were wrong, because there's a price to pay, because the last person who made a big decision got fired, on and on and on. It's very easy to fall down that trap, David.
Right. Right. Yeah. And you can create that culture of bad decision making amongst your management team if you're not careful.
You
And
can. Yep.
you do. And we talked about this, but I found myself in that situation where everybody was coming to me for,
Mm-hmm.
any little choice. What do you think? What do you think? And I created a culture where that was okay because I was the guy that could make a bunch of decisions quickly and easily, but I never taught them to make decisions. And so it was, it took a while to get the ship turned around in our organization to make people feel comfortable to make choices. And part of that as a manager is, are you teaching them to think about the problem the way you want them to think about it? And I think once you teach somebody to think about the problem in such a way that, is beneficial, then I think their decision-making quality will get better.
Right.
And that's what I strived for was, I want to teach you how to think about it and make the right choice based on the variables that I would as an owner.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so speaking of those variables, if we come back to then the more formal decision matrix analysis, the step here is to determine the decision criteria. So this is one way for complex decisions to analyze it more scientifically, if you will. So what are examples of that? So it might be, we're going to look at the criteria of the cost, of the potential return, of the ease of implementation, if it's something that we're going to install or implement, whether it's a system, a technology, a different process, it doesn't matter. How does it align with our strengths? What are the risks? What are the implications? Like, what will the impact be on our customers or key customers that affect? So what is that criteria list? You might have 5 to 10 at the most that you're going to score or evaluate. And so that's one of the things that you do in this step of gathering information, is determine that decision criteria. Now, does every big decision need that formality? No. But the bigger ones could help you with making the decision by bringing in a more objective way of measuring to help you make that go, no go decision.
Right. And I think you also had down here, where you consult experts, which I think
Exactly.
is very
Absolutely.
important.
Yep.
Over the last 30 years, how many times have I asked you for advice and help, because of just your business expertise? But, I'm big about asking other people what their thoughts are. I don't, maybe because I just don't know, or maybe I'm afraid to make the
No,
decision,
but you're really good at that. You will gather input from multiple people. At the end of the day, you'll make your decision, but you take that as an input, as a data point, the
yeah,
opinions of other people whose expertise or experience you trust. Yeah.
yeah. If these are big decisions, you don't have to go alone as an owner or CEO. You can get business advisors. Your CPAs will give you a financial perspective. Your attorney will give you a legal perspective. They can also give you some personal perspectives as well, where, how is this going to affect you personally? But don't hesitate to ask, your business network, your friends, what they think, because they're going to give you perspectives that you haven't thought of. That's going to help you build, the information you need to make the decision.
Agreed. Yeah. Well said. This is Henry Lopez with a brief break from this episode to share a business opportunity with our show advertiser, the Amazon Delivery Service Partner Program. The Amazon Delivery Service Partner Program, or Amazon DSP, is designed to empower leaders who want to launch and operate their own delivery business. Amazon DSP empowers leaders like you to launch and operate your own delivery small business and work with Amazon to make an impact on your community. Since Amazon DSP launched in 2018, over 3,500 delivery service program partners have built their own business with Amazon across 19 countries, creating over 275,000 jobs and delivering over 1 billion packages to customers around the world. Amazon is looking for hands-on owners with grit who want to hire and motivate a high-performing team of local delivery associates. No existing logistics experience is required, but it is helpful to have great customer service skills and experience managing a team. By partnering with Amazon, you'll have access to exclusive deals, services, and best-in-class technology at every stage of your business. And the Amazon DSP team will provide ongoing support as you work to launch and grow your delivery business. Learn more about the Amazon Delivery Service Partner Program and apply today at amazon.com/radio. That's amazon.com/radio. You can also find the link on the show notes page for this episode at thehowofbusiness.com. All right, so that's step 2, gather the relevant information. Step 3 is identify and evaluate now all of these alternatives. So we started with understanding what really is the problem. What is it that we're really trying to solve? What is the question that we're really trying to answer here? The decision that we're trying to make at the root level. And in some cases, like we said, selling the business is pretty obvious, but in other cases it may not be. So that's why we focused on that. What are the options? So that was the first step. What are the options here that I have to make a decision? Because hopefully we have options. It isn't just a, yes or no, but we have different paths, different ways we might go about doing that or making that decision. Then we've determined how we're going to make that decision, the decision criteria. We've taken input, we've done the research, we've collected the data. And of course, that's ongoing to some extent, but we've done that initial analysis. We might do a SWOT analysis to help us kind of understand a particular exposure point or a particular decision. For example, if we're going to open a new location, I might do a SWOT analysis to understand how I'm going to be positioned against the competition in that new region or new location. And that might be input that helps me to decide, does that make sense or not to open? Or it might just help me decide, maybe that's the wrong location. Yeah.
The other thing that I've seen really good business people do is they don't take the options that are given to them. For example,
Right.
if somebody comes to you and says, we want to buy you. Okay, so the decision criteria, can we be bought or not bought? But a good business person will sit back and say, hey, maybe there's a third or fourth option we're not thinking here, like partnerships or mergers or things along those lines. So don't, and this is a problem I have when I'm in decision mode, is somebody tells me, here's a decision criteria, and I think, okay, that's great. And I'm working off those 2 decision points where maybe there might be 3 or 4 or 5 different alternatives to that. So let your brain play with the idea of other options that were not presented to you, that might yield a solution that comes up completely different than what you thought.
Yeah, that's brilliant. All right, step 3 is then identify and evaluate those alternatives. Now that I have those alternatives, let's evaluate them. So, continue down your path here. Maybe it isn't just completely selling. Maybe I'm going to sell you one of my units or one of my locations, or we're going to partner deeply, or we're going to enter into a marketing arrangement so that we can cooperate in certain markets. Now we've got these alternatives that are on the table for us. We want to brainstorm these options. We want to think through these options and kind of walk them through and see where does it take us? Because I think that is with any decision making, as we talked about in the previous episode, in episode 526, that the skill that we end up developing that seems instinctual but is based on our experience is that ability to think a few steps ahead. And so that's when we really need to put on that experience or get the help to put on the experience, because like you said, it could be my CPA that helps me think about, but if you do that, Henry, here are the tax consequences a year later, or here are the issues you're going to have that maybe you're not thinking about 2 steps forward from a financial perspective. An attorney might highlight, that's fine, but here's where it might end up from a legal perspective. Yeah. Now, often what we have to be careful with to that point, though, David, is sometimes that advice that we get, we have to be careful who it's from and take it as a data point, right? I remember when you were thinking through selling your business, and there were financial advisors that thought, "Oh, you're crazy. How are you going to replace that income? And I would never sell the business." But they don't have a business like this to consider, right? So we do have to be careful with some of that input that we get, right?
Yeah, you're getting advice, and you're getting advice from a person that has a certain perspective, and you need to be able to take that, like you said, as a data point. You're going to weigh certain advice from certain people probably more than others. Like if you tell me something, for example, I'm probably going to weigh that more than probably someone else. But you're just gathering data, and you're listening, you're getting perspectives, and you're integrating that information into your overall decision path. But, sometimes people are wrong.
Yeah, no, exactly. And at the end of the day, you're the one that has to make the decision and live with it, right? You're the one that has
That's
to
right.
own it.
Yeah.
But certainly also making sure it's in alignment, right? So this is why it's so important to know where we're going. If we again go to the decision you had to make about selling your business, you had to look at that decision in alignment with where you were in life and what was next for you. So
Right.
does it align there? Now that's a big decision selling business. Let's say it's a decision to navigate the business in a certain direction. What'll help me make that decision is to ask myself, is this in alignment with where we want to go, with where we're headed? Now, I get it. Sometimes decisions result in a complete pivot, but whatever it might be, does it get me farther towards where I want to go? That's one way to help determine which one of those paths, which one of those options might be best for my business and for me.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think also a couple things is people, uh, when people are making these types of decisions, they, if they don't have a view of what the future looks like for them, sometimes that'll impede their ability to
Agreed.
make a decision. Because
Absolutely.
I don't know what the future looks like if I don't have this, or I don't know what it's going to look like when I retire. And so that fear keeps people from making choices and decisions. The other thing I think, and again, there's a difference between making big decisions and making complex decisions. And
Mm-hmm.
I think selling our business, it was a 9-month process that we went through to sell our business. So it was a multi-step process I was going through with the buyers in selling our business. And so I think sometimes you don't have to make the decision to sell your business. And when we first talked to them in January and February, but I did make the decision that we were interested.
Right.
And that's a very, low risk decision that I
Mm-hmm.
made to say, yeah, let's explore this. And so that was this series of many decisions that they were making and that we were making to decide if this was going to work. And so,
And then, so then you went through a series of go, no go gates, right? As you were
That's
progressing
right.
through that.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they wanted to look at this. Okay, that looked good. They want to look at that. Did it look good? Tell me what the price is. Okay, that will look good. And so at any time in that process, we could have decided not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, knowing that you might have a choice to make smaller decisions will sometimes, help you make the bigger one. So in January, February, I didn't have to decide if we were selling or not, but I was interested in exploring that possibility. And that's a much lower risk decision point.
Well said. And then the other thing that you've always shared with me that I think is a great perspective is to kind of live in it, if you will. Imagine that you've made the decision. What does that feel like? What does that look like?
Yeah, and that's something I learned in coaching was if you're having difficulty making a decision, go through a process called pre-deciding. So if you're stuck, say, okay, on Monday morning, I'm gonna pre-decide that I am doing this. And then you say, okay, I've done it, even though you haven't done it, just in your brain, tell yourself you've done it. And then sit with that for a week and see what comes up for you. And it could be a lot of, okay, I feel a lot of anxiety for doing it. My stomach doesn't feel good. My gut's telling me that's not the right decision. But a lot of times, if you can go through that pre-decision phase, things are going to come up for you that you wouldn't have done if you didn't, quote unquote, pre-decide that choice.
And I'll tell you this technique, to be honest, when you first told me, it seems silly. It's like, well, how am I going to do that? Right. But it works. It really does work. It's not 100%, obviously you didn't actually make the decision, but if you will discipline yourself to think through that, just what came to mind is I get up in the morning and I imagine, okay, I no longer have that, or I've done this. Now I got to go do this. What does that feel like? I used it, for example, David, I was evaluating starting a home cleaning business a couple years ago. And part of the reason I decided not to move forward is because I did this exercise that you recommend. I kind of envisioned what does that look like for me lifestyle wise? And it just did not align with where I wanted to be at that point in time because I envisioned, okay, I had researched enough about it, knew enough about what the day to day, had talked to enough other business owners in the industry to be able to envision, let's pretend I got up today and I own this business. What would that feel like? And it's
Yeah.
not that it was a bad thing, and it's not that I still think it's a great business opportunity, but it wasn't an alignment for me at that point in time.
No, I think that's great. And I think when I decided to go ahead and transition my consulting business to my current partner, the feeling of, I'm going to say, weight on your shoulders. And again, this is
Mm-hmm.
kind of an intuitive part of decision making. And it's interesting going through this whole exercise because we're putting down a lot of the informational things that you can do, but there's a lot of intuition that comes into play when you're making a decision. But with you, when you said, okay, I'm doing it, you felt a weight on your shoulders, I
Mm-hmm.
think, and you
Mm-hmm.
feel like, oh, this is going to be a burden. It's not going to give me the flexibility I want.
Mm-hmm.
With me, when I decided to sell my business, the weight lifted off of my shoulders and how
Yeah.
good I felt when I pre-decided that, kind of helped me understand from an intuitive standpoint that this is probably a good choice for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Similarly, if we kind of maybe flip it a little bit, we've been talking about here, but let's say it's a decision. I work with clients sometimes and they're making a decision about growth, expansion, the next location, because sometimes we think that's what we're supposed to do, right? And so similarly, if the decision is based on that, it's based on expansion, an opportunity, let's say to buy a business or open another location, I often will have people explore those feelings because what might be holding you back from it is you may not want that additional responsibility. You may not want what's going to come with that, which is, maybe 6 months of you having to be at that location or whatever the case might be, especially if you don't have quite the team in place yet. So thinking through how will that feel if I imagine I've made that decision is a really powerful emotional tool to help us make these decisions. Now, we got to
Yeah.
be careful that it doesn't paralyze us, but it is another tool that we can use to help us make complex decisions.
It also helps you understand what's driving you to make this
Well
choice.
said.
And
Yeah.
in the US, when it comes to business, growth is everything. We've got to
Correct.
grow. If we're not
Yep.
growing, we're
We're
not,
dying. Yeah.
we're dying. It's all those type of things. But that's a uniquely American thing. There's a lot of countries in the world where having one coffee shop is perfectly fine for your whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, I don't need three or four. I've got one. It's working for me. So, are you feeling pushed to do something? And that's an important thought process you need to go through. Is that something where your friends are forcing you to grow? I felt that pressure in the car wash industry that I didn't have a lot of units, and maybe two or three are fine. I had car wash friends that had one that had a perfectly great business and enjoyed it. So, and
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to grow if that's something you're not interested in doing.
Well said. All right. So on this step, which is step number 3 here that we're at, that we've been talking about, which is identify and evaluate the alternatives. I mean, certainly these steps, if I were to kind of allocate how much time, this is an important step. You're really thinking through all these different options. It's another step where you can get hung up and get in a quagmire. But if we go back to the decision matrix approach, if we have that criteria, if that's what we've done here, we identified that criteria. For example, let's say my decision criteria is going to be, I'm going to evaluate option A, B, or C based on cost, potential return on investment, alignment with our vision and our strengths, the things that we do well, and risk mitigation. Let's say those are my 4 criteria. Then what I might want to do is weight those, apply a weight to it, right? Not all the 4 are not equal. There might be, for example, the return on investment, because this particular decision is a project, let's say, that's going to require a capital investment, or I might have to get a loan, or whatever the case might be. I'm going to weigh that potential ROI higher. So it begins to bring, again, a more scientific approach to decision making. And that is that you don't just have criteria that you're now going to grade or scale on a scale of 1 to 5, but it's weighted. And I'm going to put an example on the show notes page. So for people like me who struggle with math, it'll be all spelled out. But the concept is the key thing here, David. You've got this decision criteria you identified. You probably will weight it because not every criteria is equal. You're going to make that determination. That in part is helping you make the decision. In other words, this decision, as a lot of them are in business, the return on investment of this decision is critical. So I'm going to weigh that heavier. And then I'm going to score them. And then now that becomes a more subjective additional data point for me to consider.
Yeah. I'm looking at your, that particular, weighting and matrix and everything. And it's certainly when there's multiple variables, especially when you're looking for a return on your investment and cost and decisions along those lines, that's certainly very important to go through, because a lot of times you might make decisions to make investments where you're not going to have an ROI, but the alignment's very high.
Correct.
So
exactly.
I like that.
Where it's necessary for other reasons. This I don't know, call it, let's say, more technical approach. I think I've seen it also used in organizations where now you've got a leadership team, you're empowering them to make higher level decisions. Maybe they have P&L responsibility for a particular location or product line. And what you're giving them is a way to do some of this decision analysis, and a way for you to help them and make sure that they're going about it as objectively as possible. And then you bring in, and they bring in as well, because they have experience as well, that other side of it that you've been talking about, David, the more emotional side, the feeling side that's based on those instincts that you've developed over time.
Yeah, if you're a large organization, I think the feelings part isn't going to really play in. If you're
No, it
the owner
doesn't. Yeah,
or
exactly.
CEO of a smaller company, or a solo operation, I think what you think and what you feel kind of weigh in more. But as I'm looking at your ratings, I think the important one is risk, and I think I've always had this intuitive ability to mitigate and manage risk. I think in terms of risk with pretty much everything I do in business. And I feel like I'm pretty good at it, but I'm thinking about risk, I'm mitigating risk, I'm taking risk into consideration, because every decision has risk to it.
Right.
And so, if it's a high risk situation, then, the decision making process needs to be a lot more thorough and detailed if it's, but I always try to find a way, how do I make this a lower risk decision?
When you decided to open the third location of the car wash, how did you think through this component of risk? What were the things, if you can think back to, that you
Um,
evaluated related to risk?
yeah, I mean, you look at the attributes of the site, which helps you with risk. You look at the opportunity in the market and helps you with risk. You start doing the performas to see how many cars you think you need to do per month, which helps you understand what the risk is. Um, there's a lot of things that you can do from an informational gathering standpoint to see what your risk is.
Operationally, I'm assuming you also looked at, how is this going to distract me from my two very profitable, very successful locations? And I think one of the
Yeah,
ways that we mitigated that is that then that's when we justified bringing in area GM, somebody who oversaw all
yeah,
three of them, right?
yeah. But in that case, that minimized my risk by
Correct.
increasing
That's
the
how you
numbers because
mitigated that exposure, right?
yeah, was we could spread that cost out over 3 units instead of 2 units.
And now you had increased oversight because you could now afford to have that additional person that oversaw the managers at each of the three locations.
Right, right. But it's like any situation that you and I ran into it when we created our yogurt business was, you have two great sites and one bad site, it's going to drag down the whole,
That's right. It drags down the whole
chain.
brand. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Okay. Step four is to make the darn decision, right? Sounds obvious, but that's the thing we've been alluding to and touching on throughout this whole conversation, is that at the end of the day, we got to make a decision. Now, as David pointed out, for these more complex decisions, the right approach might be to make a series of smaller decisions. And that often, I think that's such a brilliant strategy that people don't, I don't know why we don't think about it. But sometimes the option is, well, maybe we don't bite off that entire chunk. Maybe we take a small step. Maybe, let's use the restaurant industry. Maybe instead of opening another location there, we have a food truck that shows up in that area. Or we do a
right.
pop-up. I always go to that example because it's an easy one to understand or follow. In other words, maybe there's a step in between that big decision and no decision at all that helps us validate that, helps us further make that decision, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, food trucks and pop-ups are great examples of how the restaurant industry has mitigated their risk.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As well as retail. My daughter's doing that with her vintage clothing retail. So that's another environment in which that makes a lot of sense to validate before you all in on the decision of opening a retail storefront.
Right.
So again, we're comparing, if you're doing the more detailed criteria analysis, the weighted analysis of the decision matrix, you see what that tells you. But that's not the only component. It's just a data point. We might break it down into smaller steps. And again, though, at the end of the day, now that you have done all of that work, you got to make a decision. And as David said, we cannot second guess ourselves too much. I pause there because I get it. We've all been there. We want to make the right decisions. But that construct, as you explain, is false, right? We're
Yeah.
making the best informed decision we possibly can. It is my job and my team's job to be smart about it, to apply our knowledge, to get help, to analyze it, to do the research, to do the work. But at the end of the day, we have to make a decision and there are no guarantees.
Yeah. I like that term, Henry, of best decision. Because right and wrong puts an absolute on it, which I think is incorrect.
I love that. That's the way
So,
to say it. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to touch on this on the last episode, but the time got away with us. And as we start to wrap it up here, you've talked about at times, as it relates to decision fatigue and making the best option. And we sometimes get into a slump. Both of you and I have, because we've talked to each other about it. And that is one of the ways that we get out of it, right? That's one of the benefits of having a partner. But when you think back to times where you felt like, man, it doesn't seem like I can make a right decision to save my life, not to mention my business. What has worked for you to get out of that slump and regain your confidence?
yeah, it's interesting because I went through a really bad slump with the car washes where I just couldn't make. It could be a physical issue. It could be you're tired.
Hmm.
You're not sleeping well. You're not eating well. You're working too much. You got to make sure that your physical plant is in tip top shape if you're going to be able to make decisions. Um, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because it's hard to identify why you go through a slump and how you
Hmm.
get out of it. But, you might need to kind of draw the wagons in and get some additional help when you're making some of those decisions at those points. And sometimes you get critical of yourself where you're making decisions that don't turn out the way you think they were going to turn out. And so then you label them as wrong. And then you get a series of those and you think, oh, I've made all these wrong decisions. Well, as my lovely wife likes to correct, they're not wrong decisions. You made some decisions that had different outcomes than you thought, but that's probably the way they were going to go anyway. Um, and
Yeah.
so a lot of it is you get into a self-critical mindset of decisions that you start making. And I think that's when things start snowballing.
Yeah, and then that voice creeps in, right? That is whomever that is in your
Yeah.
life, maybe
Yeah.
that told you you weren't worth it, and so that creeps in. You start hearing that, and
Well, I think people that listen to this podcast and people that are business owners are high performing individuals. And so they can be very critical of themselves.
absolutely,
And that can creep in when you feel like you're not getting, what you want or the results that you want. Um, and so that's what you got to be careful of. And that could be what drives that is, your high standards could drive that. You're wanting to perform at a high level can drive that. Your criticism of yourself can drive that, which then translate into criticism of other people, which can drive that. So,
yeah,
if you find yourself in kind of in that slump, that would be my guess is where that's coming from.
absolutely, yeah. For both of us, what I have seen that we each do is we lean on each other. Hopefully, we're not in a slump at the same time, so,
Yep.
but we talk about it is the key thing. And then the thing I always think about, which doesn't necessarily help when I'm in a deep, upset about it, but it does put it in perspective. I always say, and I've said it many times on the show, bigger organizations with many more resources and incredibly brighter people than me, higher education, smarts, lots of them, they make bad decisions all the time that turn out not to be the right decision. So who am I to think I'm not going to make some decisions that don't work out to the best, right? It's what it is. It comes with the territory, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's interesting that even the larger companies, can make bad decisions. I
Yeah,
remember
major blunder. So who am I? Me, you, and me. Yeah, we're pretty sharp individuals, but you know, we're going to make some decisions that don't work out to the best, and it's going to happen, right?
yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because when you and I think about that and I think about when we lived in Texas there in Grapevine, they were building a Hummer dealership,
Oh yeah,
kind of across the highway from where we lived.
right
And I
on
drove by that and said,
114.
that's never going to work. And sure enough, but that's what my gut told me when I saw that. And, that's General Motors. I mean, these guys are,
I know, I know.
these guys, know what they're doing. And
Talk about
we
an
see,
investment they made to make that thing.
oh yeah, gosh. I mean, it was hundreds of millions of dollars probably,
Yeah.
to set up that brand and create that dealer network. And, we see that with companies, they get in, they get out, right? Or whatever. But we see that all the time. So that there is a little bit of comfort that even the big boys don't get it right all the time.
Agreed. And then the other thing we've talked about here that helps with us is make smaller decisions as part of getting us out of a slump, right? So everything doesn't have to be a monumental decision, and so talk about it, get the help, realize that this is just part of the process, realize that you're looking at these things now in retrospect, and that's easy. If that's what it took, everybody would be doing it, but that's not the way it works, right? As a business owner, you have to make the decisions without having that crystal ball or the magic 8 ball that's accurate that tells us it's right. And so so apply this approach, this method for these more complex decisions, And that, I think, helps us to get there and feel confident that I've done the best work possible, the best research possible to make the best decision I have available to me right now. And that's to me, that's my takeaway. What would you say is one key takeaway for you, David, for this conversation?
Yeah, this will get better with practice, and you've got to be aware of what you're doing. So, come up with awareness of what you're good at from a decision-making standpoint. Make sure you surround your team if you need help making decisions, and just find out what you're good at and find out what you think you need to work on from a decision standpoint.
Agreed. All right, excellent. Another great conversation, David. Thanks for helping me with this.
Yeah, thanks for
episode.
having me. Always fun to do.
Absolutely. Again, if you want to learn more about kind of the decision-making process, go back and listen to episode 526 that David and I released recently. And again, on the show notes page for this episode, I'll lay out this decision matrix that I highlighted. So it'll kind of be spelled out there in a better example for you to follow as maybe a structure or an approach to decision making. This is Henry Lopez, and thanks for joining myself and David Begin for this episode of The How of Business. We wish you the best as you start and grow your successful and profitable small business. I release new episodes every Monday morning, and you can find the show anywhere you listen to podcasts, including the How of Business YouTube channel and at my website, thehowofbusiness.com. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to The How of Business. For more information about our coaching programs, online courses, show notes pages, links, and other resources, please visit thehowofbusiness.com.